Thank you, Vochko, and thank you to the organizers for having accepted my paper, and I hope I can make a small contribution to the full field of online teaching and technology enhancement, which is what I am trying to present you today, which is the use of two technologies, one older, which is radio, and one newer, which is sound editing software, in order to produce material that we can use in the classroom and for self-study and in different levels. So the aim is to see how we can do this, and I will use a software that you are maybe familiar with, which is Audacity. I don't know if you know that. There are plenty of audio sound software edition tools. I use mainly this because it goes with the philosophy of ORCIT, which is open software and free source. So what I'm going to try to take you through in this 20 minutes that I hope to take is to first of all discuss the potential of media interpreting for training purposes, see what has been done and how we are dealing with it, and then move on to dialogue interpreting, which is my main field of research and study and practice, and see how we can learn from a specific setting, which is live radio interpreting events for the class. And I will give you some examples of materials I have created for my own class and workshops, and I test and keep testing in different classes. So first of all, the potential for training of media interpreting. Many of you who teach interpreting here, who I am aware you are in the room, you may use media events from, I don't know, an Oscar award ceremony to a press conference to a live radio interview that you have recorded. Is that the case for some of you? Maybe you do. The potential is huge, and we can really have a lot of material down there or there in the internet. For example, one of the potentials I usually describe is the how to show best practices or practices that we could criticize of interpreters' actual performances. And I will show you later how I use that integrated in my classroom as a way of raising awareness of what media interpreting entails before students get to do an exercise. And I will use the example of the data I used in my PhD, which are live interviews in Radio 3, which is kind of cultural, artistic, radio station, which is part of the public service radio interpreting in Spain, and particularly one of the film programs. And then, of course, there is a potential for practice, that is taking interviews, speeches, press conferences, debates that happen in the media, and we can use them for our classroom and self-study. Now, let's narrow down the field to dialogue interpreting, which is one of the modules we teach at Heriot-Watt at different stages in the training, from undergraduate to the masters, but also in specific workshops in media interpreting. The big issues, I think, well, Marlene has touch upon a few of them when we are working with dialogue interpreting, whether it is community interpreting or media interpreting or business interpreting, which is accessing original interpreter-mediated data. How can we bring an actual interpreter-mediated conversation to the classroom? And therefore, giving students credible and authentic dialogues. We can have a discussion about authentic and actual and what we believe that is. And I think this is the context to have that discussion. The solutions we give, or we tend to give, We see it very well in ORCIT with really great examples. We have seen it in research. Cecilia Vadencio as well has an article where she mentions how role play tends to be the solution, and different examples, and a research on how we can maximize role play in liaison interpreting. And then there are other practical examples like handbooks of liaison interpreting. I give one we use in class with performed and recorded dialogues, performed by actors, but I think here many people, you could give many examples of the actual dialogues you produce. So these are solutions to bring authenticity to the class. Now, what I am trying to do, or to contribute to this teaching of dialogue interpreting, is to teach it as it happened, to try to find actual interpreter-mediated dialogues, see how we can grade the level and use them in class, which is, again, a problem because of the lack of dialogue interpreting, because many of these settings, as we know, happen behind closed doors. So this is where the media is interesting, where radio is interesting, because we get conversations, which is what we need. We have conversations which are interpreted, therefore not conversations that we need to tweak and imagine there was an interpreter there, so they happen, and then we can see how we insert them in the class. The solution to use those dialogue is, in a way, I will show it in a very simple way, which is editing these dialogues, basically removing the sound or the track of the interpreter through Audacity. And then we have to think at which stage. This morning we had a really nice conversation or Q&A with Matthew mentioning when we really have to know when to use these materials. So I use levels of difficulty inspired by Jesús de Manuel Jerez to bring or to grade these dialogues and insert them in the class. Okay. All this brings me to the approach, the pedagogical and research and training approach I use, which I think is really the core of this conference as well, from instruction to collaboration. That is research action. That is practice informs research. We analyze it. I studied, in my case, a similar study that Marlene did, interactional aspects, discursive aspects, and organizational aspects of radio interpreting. We see how it works. We see how we can put it in practice into training. We test it with the students. We see how the model works. And then the findings, we bring them back to practice. That's the way research action in a theoretical and practical way works. So having mentioned my pedagogical and research approach, let's mention the example I want to show you today. First of all, when we find an audio that we find it is fine and an interview that we really think fits the classroom or the year we are teaching in, we have to provide the students with a context, an authentic context. Yeah. Now, the main problem, I hope I anticipate this question, is how do we get the students to prepare for this dialogue that you are going to give them for this briefing, this radio interview, without them finding the dialogue, and then they know it. Here is where I try to have a deal with the students. Yeah. I give them authentic information as the interpreter was given when they were hired. So I research, I contact the radio station, I ask them the conditions on which the interpreter was called, and then I replicate that in class and give them the medium, the station, the program, the information the interpreter was given, trying to replicate the same time frame the interpreter was given, and the situational arrangement. That is, how they were sat on the table if I don't have visual access to that interview. Yeah? And I asked the students to please not listen to the podcast. And again, we are at university, and usually it works. Students, if you tell them that this is going to benefit you much more if you do it realistically, then they won't waste their time listening to the podcast, because later, after they do the exercise, they can listen to it as many times as we can, and we actually do that. So, having done that, I'm going to show you the way a usual class using this material will work, how I do it usually in my classes, and how I'm testing it, and then see if it makes sense for you, and to apply it and give me your feedback. I am using the example of an interview with Viktor Kosakowski, which is a Russian filmmaker. He's not speaking Russian in the interview, English, in this Spanish radio program. And can I see this? Okay. And students, of course, could access the podcast website for the radio station. This is what the students, if they do their research, or if I can give them the podcast, is what they find. Yeah? Basic information about the interview and a bit of contextualization. So this is precisely what I tell students not to listen if I give them just that framework information. Now, what do I give them before we work with that interview? If it is the first class, and let's say this would be 4th year for undergraduate liaison interpreting, or a first introduction to media interpreting, if none of the students, which is usually the case, have worked on the radio, I remind them what radio is and what an interpreter does in radio. So how, and this is part of my research, I show a little clip of one of the clips I find interesting so that they get into the shoes of the radio interpreter. Okay? So I'm going to share it with you. It's just 1 minute, and the fun starts. If I find it here with all the pam, 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 pam. And why is it not here? Okay. There are English subtitles in this one. This is a video of the studio recording of an actual interview with an interpreter.
El árbol de las palabras, este tiempo de cine posible desde Radio Exterior de España, que se escuchará África, Oriente, Asia, por supuesto América y por supuesto el mundo. Hoy tenemos el placer de encontrarnos con dos bellísimas mujeres, pero no están aquí por su belleza, por supuesto, sino por su inteligencia y por su talento. Estamos hablando de una mujer que se llama Fatima Motamiyali y otra mujer es Rima, que es la que traduce, la que nos hace realmente fácil las conversaciones siempre que tenemos que hacer una conversación con una personalidad de definición.
Fine, we are in the setting. We've seen the studio, we've seen the work with the mics, we've seen how the interpreter is managing the interaction. Every interpreter, we can see that many interpreters have different ways of dealing with the radio, dealing with a sound technician. That would be for maybe another talk. Yeah. And then, this is like part of the making of. And then we go back to our particular setting. So we just say, imagine yourself there, or yourselves there. But for that, we need the edition. So this is a very quick look at the work we would have to do with this liaison or interpreter-mediated radio interview. As you can imagine here, this is the full program, or the full interview, and we see the sound waves of the full track of the interview. So at this moment, of course, we cannot know what is the journalist, the interviewee, the interpreter, music, blah, blah, blah. While we listen, we have, I hope you can see the the arrow here, we can see the pointer where it is and where it goes, and by using very simple tools, which I will bring now, we can zoom in, get a clear, precise timing of every intervention, and start silencing the interpreter. This is a basic thing we would do. By zooming in, we look for the interpreter's voice, and then we silence it. Yeah? Now, according to the level, depending on the level you are teaching, either you leave, if you are looking for masters or experienced interpreters, I would edit out the sound and leave it with the exact timing the professional interpreter or the interpreter there used. If we are starting, if it is the first day for liaison interpreting in 4th year or in the initial stages of liaison, what I do is I add around 3 seconds for each 10 seconds to the blank sound so that students are not stressed. Yeah, of course, it's radio and we need dynamism. They still have a time pressure, but they can work on it. And in radio, even if in my interviews I prove that because it's radio, interpreters try to avoid overlapping talk when the sound technician is not cooperating, sometimes there is overlapping talk. So what I do, if there is a massive overlapping talk where 2 or 3 people talk at a time, I just edit out the whole bit. So the interview looks like it makes sense, but still it can be practiced. Okay, so you are going to see what the students would experience. For the Spanish bits, I think we have the interpreters, but it doesn't really matter if you don't follow Spanish. And then we'll see the result with the actual broadcast. Okay, this is the game. I suggest now, if I can find it. Okay, so we are well into the interview, and this is the edited for class, as you can see.
Sí. Señor Kosakowski, buenas tardes.
Добрый день, здравствуйте. Hello.
¿Está a gusto? ¿Está bien? ¿Se encuentra bien viniendo a España, invitado a hablar de cine, a enseñar su película? Es grato, es divertido.
Can I ask you, are you making radio show only, or are you also making TV show sometimes?
You see the gaps?
¿Por qué?
Because you are funny. You look very funny. Like, I believe people will very enjoy to see your face and the way you use your hands. Look at your hands now. You see, you don't know where to put them, and the way you use your tongue, it's always out of your mouth, and the way you look at your glasses. So funny glasses.
Okay, we could go on for the full class. Okay. And you see the gaps that are quite realistic. This one is for the 4th year, so the gap is just the time the interpreter spent. Okay, now the student have worked with it. We have a feedback session. I listen to them, the usual feedback, and then we have the actual evidence, which is what happened in real life. Let's move here. This is the one, and I just have to go 2 minutes.
Muy buenas noches desde el cine de Buenas tardes.
Добрый день, здравствуйте. Hello.
Good evening, Mr. Kosakowski.
¿Está a gusto? ¿Está bien? ¿Se encuentra bien viniendo a España, invitado a hablar de cine, a enseñar su película? Es grato, es divertido.
Are you happy coming to Spain to talk about your film? Is this a nice experience for you?
Can I ask you, are you making radio show only, or are you also making TV show sometimes?
¿Puedo preguntarle si hace usted shows de radio solamente o también de televisión?
¿Por qué?
Why are you asking this question?
Because you are funny. You look very funny. Like, I believe people will very enjoy to see your face and the way you use your hands. Look at your hands now. You see, you don't know where to put them, and the way you use your tongue. It's always out of your mouth, and the way you look at your glasses. So funny glasses.
Es el aspecto que tiene usted, que tiene un aspecto divertido, la forma
and
en
the way
que
you talk, like very interesting. Because
la forma que
you
usa
kind of
las
shy.
manos.
And the madness starts. And you could see that I was edited out, and then I bring it back to a part of the interview where we can work with it in the class. Okay, so that brings me to the conclusions. We can see the benefits. I'm sure you can see them, and I'm sure you can criticize them as well, of using original interpreter-mediated dialogues. Just imagine how rich the conversation, the feedback chat can be when students can compare and in the last 10 minutes of the class. The engagement, and this is where I will bring back later, the need for questionnaires so we can measure the actual engagement, the empowerment the students feel when they work with exercises, the feel for authenticity. That is being measured. That's work in progress now. The technology enhancement it's clear, the possibilities is clear, and the one thing that radio brings is, for interpreters, and I hope you agree, is this quality sound. Radio offers great quality, so that's one problem solved when we work with online and materials and online for self-study. And there is a potential there, particularly in public service radio stations. My experience with the Spanish public radio stations is great because it is an open domain, so they give you permission to work with these audios. So I can use these podcasts that are publicly available, and it is using materials that were underused up to now. This action research project offers the possibility of replicating it. If you want, if you have in mind some radio stations which do this, please do it, and let's be in touch and then see how it works for you. And still there are pedagogical challenges, which is where I would love also the discussions to go. I mentioned the work in progress. We have to engage with the students and see how they receive this. I'm measuring this with questionnaires at the moment, their reception, their perception, and engage with broadcasters. My initial engagement with Radio 3 was great. They become more aware of how to work with interpreters, and then you can give them something back. And then the enlargement of a database that we can use as a community of trainers. This is for a future paper, I hope, that comes out of this. And thank you very much.
So thank you. And we have time for a question or two. Over there, Matthew.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed that presentation, and I had a lot of fun with the example that you gave us too. But I guess it won't surprise you that my question is of a pedagogical nature. And at the end of the student workshop yesterday, I raised a question of how we can teach students to be sensitive to the impact of their choices, that what they say has an impact on the person listening. And since you're from Spain, as is the other panelist, I'd just like to give you a very, very quick example from the novel A Heart So White by Javier Marías, where he imagines a dialogue between Margaret Thatcher and Felipe González. And Felipe González says to her, "Would you like a whiskey?" And the interpreter says, "Do they love you in your country?" And the conversation then continues on the basis of what the interpreter has said, which was manipulating the conversation completely. So, given that it is possible to manipulate conversations, my question is, does the student here not get an answer to what the original interpreter asked rather than what the student is actually asking?
That is the problem with the recording. Yeah, so this doesn't substitute, for example, role play, because in role play, the great thing that we have is that we react, whoever does the role play reacts to what the student says. Here, the feedback, I would say they get two types of feedback. First one, the fact that the conversation doesn't follow along the lines that the student thought. So this is the first kind of immediate feedback the student gets. And I think that probably has to be more studied and more reported on when we use materials that we cannot modify according to the student response. And then there is the feedback coming from the trainer when he's listening to a student in particular, and then said, did you see that here? You went through other lines, and then the conversation would have changed completely. Yeah? And then that's where the debate, if I can be very brief, is interesting. Because students come and say, but how do I start telling the presenter about the funny hands and the hair in the fingers and all that? Shouldn't I tell the interviewee that this is about his cinema? And then I say, well, when you are in radio, then do it, and do it live. And see what you can cause. So I think that's a very interesting question for the trainer, but to remind them that a decision could just take this interview to a completely different direction. I see that, yeah. I don't know if I answered your question, but it's the two types of feedback they get.
So, if there is no more questions, thank you, Pedro, once again, for your presentation.